Good evening, everybody. Welcome. So glad that you could join us. I'm Matt Molina with NYCH2O. I'm excited to be joined tonight by our speaker, Lucy Sante, and my colleague, Katie Strom. It's great that everybody could join us. We'll give folks a couple more minutes to come in, and while we're doing that, please let us know where you're joining us from. And it's always fun to find out in this Zoom world that we live in, where folks are dialing in from. We'll give people a few more minutes to come in, but let us know in the chat where you're dialing in from. All right, we got Brooklyn, Brazil. Wow, cool. My friend from Brazil, how did you hear about the program? Northern Manhattan, Pennsylvania, Queens. Where in Pennsylvania? Westchester, Brooklyn, Union Square, NYC. Beautiful. The Poconos.
Yeah.
Very nice.
Pennsylvania, East Strasburg.
Awesome. Forest Hills, Queen. Great. Nice. Melville, Long Island. Hello, Mitch. Manhattan, Tuckahoe, New York. Up in Westchester. Nice. We have Lower East Side. And we have Ontario, Canada. Very nice. Beautiful. So once again, welcome to everyone. If you're just joining us, I'm Matt with NYCH2O. I'm honored to have our speaker, Lucy Sante, award-winning author, joining us tonight, who will read selections from her new book, 19 Reservoirs. We're also joined by Katie, my colleague at NYCH2O. Oh, great. We have Ridgewood in the house. Nice. Ridgewood, Queens. Beautiful. So we'll get started in just a minute. But first, well, while we are waiting for more folks to join us, for those of you who are new to NYCH2O, we are a nonprofit based in New York City, and we provide environmental education programs and ecological stewardship programs all across the city. And I want to start by thanking all of you for attending, and all our members that support us, our board who donates their resources and time so generously, and the city council, whose all support makes programs like this possible. So thank you to you all. So once again, welcome everybody. I am super excited to have Lucy Sante joining us tonight, who will read from her new book, 19 Reservoirs. And for those of you who don't already know, Lucy Sante is the author of many books, as she lives in the Catskill watershed region. And her other books include Low Life, The Factory of Facts, Kill All Your Darlings, The Other Paris, and Maybe the People Would Be the Times. Her awards include a Whiting Writers Award. Oh, I know the director of that organization. Cool. An award in literature from the American Academy of Arts and Letters, and a Grammy for album notes, an Infinity Award from the International Center of Photography, and a Guggenheim and Coleman Fellowships. I just want to remind everyone, please stay on mute, and you can turn your cameras off. It improves on the transmission. And feel free to type your questions in the chat, but we want to give Lucy our undivided attention, and then she will gladly answer questions after she finishes reading her selected excerpts. So Lucy, welcome, and we're so excited to have you join us. Oh, come off of mute.
Thought I'd unmuted, but I hadn't. Hi, so great to be here, coming to you from Kingston, New York tonight. I'm going to read you a few selections from throughout the course of my book, 19 Reservoirs, which had its genesis in the 90s when I first moved up to Delaware County, New York, near the Pipacton Reservoir. And then in 2000, I moved to very near the Ashokan Reservoir. So these things have been slowly building in my head. I'm not a water expert. I was drawn by the human story, first of all. So here we go. Once the idea of importing water had seeded itself in the public mind, it was hard to dislodge, for without more reliable sources, the city could not survive. The moral justification for the seizure of water belonging to other regions, the landowners were always compensated, but under the terms of eminent domain, they were not permitted to refuse, was invariably that the needs of the many overrode the rights of the few. That was true as far as it went. More and better water would benefit immigrants, freed slaves, disabled veterans, the chronically ill, and the destitute, in addition to the middle and upper classes. But although such arguments were politically convenient, the architects of New York's water importation schemes across the decade seem to have been rather more concerned with the needs of business. The requirements of the great mass of people reached their ears only on occasions when the city was in the grip of what was called a water famine, when pipes lacked sufficient pressure to serve the upper stories of buildings, making the whole metropolis a fire hazard. It follows that politicians and their commissioners tended to think of the extramural regions from which they proposed to pump as essentially uninhabited, since no industry was occurring there. Their attitude, in a word, was colonial. You could say that the very idea of diverting water from somewhere else to benefit the inhabitants of New York City represents a version of the trolley problem. In that ethical thought experiment, you were standing by the switch as a rail car comes barreling along, headed for 5 people tied up on the tracks. You can pull the lever and turn the car onto a branch line, but there you see 1 person tied up. Do you do nothing and permit 5 deaths, or act and cause 1? Do you do nothing and impose a water famine on a teeming city? Or do you pull the lever and shift the onus onto much more sparsely populated rural areas? There is no satisfactory solution to this dilemma, and New York City had no real choice. In 1905, New York City's Water Supply Board assembled a crack team of engineers and sent them off to survey the Catskill territory. They proposed that the main dam be constructed at Bishop Falls in Olive Bridge, which had solid bedrock and would permit the work to be done 2 years sooner than at rival sites. Ulster County did not possess sufficient political sway or capital to resist. Bishop Falls was a tourist attraction, a gently curved array of shallow falls in narrowing tiers like a fan, shown in numerous prints and postcards, poised between a mill on one bank and a barn on the other, with Catskill peaks in the distance. The area had long been a summer resort for city people who could afford second homes, but had more recently been democratized by the establishment of boarding houses, where visitors would pay for a bed, perhaps a bath, and 3 meals taken communally, and generally spend their time loafing. John Boyce, who owned the falls, valued his property at $500,000. Under the relentless terms of the city's condemnation commissions, the 3-person boards that reviewed evidence, heard witnesses, and set final valuations on land the city sought to seize, Boyce was eventually given $112,303.18. Bishop Falls now lies at the deepest part of the reservoir. Isaac Whitaker owned the romantic gorge below the falls, which was said to be one of the most sightly places in the mountains, and was constantly subject to offers by prospective hoteliers. It was assessed by the city at less than $5,000. The Ashokan Valley was not, in fact, highly regarded in Kingston, the county seat, where more prosperous citizens regarded themselves as urbane, cultured, and educated to a degree that made them equal to their metropolitan cousins, and quite unlike the hayseeds of the valley, who were barely capable of subsistence farming, and added little to the county's economic profile. Despite its farms, which seldom produced much to export, despite its bluestone quarries, which had for decades had supplied sidewalk paving to the city of New York, and despite its forests, rich in spruce, pine, maple, ash, oak, and hickory, the valley's principal economic engine was in fact tourism. In the summer of 1907, the New York Times found the proceedings rustically comical. A farmer told their reporter he wanted the city to pay for rabbits and woodcocks driven away by the commotion. Someone else's cow ate a stick of dynamite and died, for which he was given $100 by the contractors. But of course, each condemnation revealed a small, specific narrative. The local jumble of small villages and small holdings was home to other recurring types: shopkeepers, boarding house keepers, millers and blacksmiths and quarrymen, ministers and school teachers. Their connection to the world beyond their own fence lines was, at best, the daily newspaper. Few had telephones. The trip to Kingston, no more than 10 miles away, was undertaken by most maybe a couple of times a year. They spent very little money, consuming mostly things they cultivated themselves or bartered for with a neighbor. But they weren't isolated. Dense family ties spread across the region, and neighbors had been the same for decades. They were bonded and pledged and sealed to the land. There probably are not two properties exactly alike in the entire Ashokan region, wrote the Kingston Daily Freeman, and elements and circumstances which enter into one case will be supplanted by very different elements in a different case. Among some of the people of Ulster County, the Times wrote, many deeds are unrecorded and have to be obtained directly from the owners to be copied. In the mountains, deeds are handed from one person to another when land is transferred, and so pass through many hands without ever being recorded. The communities, some of them dating back to the mid-18th century, were valley villages of the sort that, had the reservoir never intervened, might have grown to support 2 gas stations and a regional high school, or they might have just blown away. Their only remaining trace, a historical marker on a roadside. At one commission hearing, a witness from New York City professed himself unable to construe what exactly was Brown Station. A citizen named Edwin Burhans volunteered to enlighten him. Brown Station includes everybody who receives mail from the Brown Station post office. There are 57 buildings. 12 of these are used for residential purposes only. There is a school maintained by the local authorities, a post office, and a railroad depot. A public telephone, a telegraph office, and a store complete the places of prominence. He adds that from the post office, the village extends 1 mile west, more than a mile east, 1¼ miles north, and 1 3/4 south. The population consists of 57 families. There are 9 or 10 boarding houses, 2 sawmills, a pulp mill, and several quarries. There are 5 roads, one of which leads to the pulp mill and then goes on to Kingston. The others are more local issues. Pressed by a commissioner, Burhans admits that, yes, all 5 roads could be really considered one big road. A decade and a half later, the residents of Gilboa, forewarned by the example of their Ulster County cousins, put up fierce if ineffectual resistance, relying on the fact that city employees could not legally enter their houses to turn them out. When people refused to move, however, workers tore off their roofs. Even then, some hung on, in empty houses, having prudently removed their furniture. Mary Brooks stood firm until she had to leave for a minute to confer with a neighbor. whereupon workers set her house on fire. A large fire in October 1925, which consumed 18 buildings, may also have been deliberately set. One man had a brainstorm early on. He built a new house in a critical location, thinking he could soak the assessors. When he was offered a niggling sum, he refused to leave. But he made the mistake of advertising rooms for rent, which gave workers legal right to enter. When the man stepped out on an errand, they padlocked the house. The New York Times noted in 1925 that of the residents of Gilboa in 1917, almost a third are dead, and suggested that broken hearts had hastened their end. The 1,330 bodies lying in 7 cemeteries also had to be moved. A witness recalled years later that when the graves were open, the only thing that remained intact were men's silk ties. In the 1990s, I lived not far from the Pacton Reservoir, the existence of which I barely knew before I got there, despite having spent the previous 25 years as its beneficiary in New York City. Within a month or so of taking up residence in Delaware County, I was struck by the local attitude toward the reservoir. Its construction was spoken of as if it were a disaster, a volcanic eruption, say, that might have occurred decades previously, but whose consequences resonated into the present day. Displaced citizens of the drowned villages, who were then still numerous, never felt fully accepted or at home in their new towns. They held regular reunions with testimonials and home movies, and wrote wrenching reminiscences in local newspapers and self-published books. To be sure, as a former Tompkins town supervisor said of those displaced by the Cannonsville Reservoir, which was completed in 1965, there were people who couldn't wait to get out, people who took it lying down, and people who took what they could get. But an air of permanent mourning hovered over the county. The reservoir displaced 974 people, roughly 250 from Shavertown, 175 from Arena, 100 from Union Grove, 70 from Pepacton, and the remainder from outlying farms. In addition, 2,588 bodies had to be moved from 13 cemeteries, many of them to the new Pepacton Cemetery, created for that purpose. The villages were tiny and of an earlier age. Pepacton, which had one general store and about 25 houses, had only been incorporated since 1902, although it had been a center of commercial shad fishing since 1785. Arena, known as Lumbertown until around 1890, began as a single store in 1795. Shavertown, the hub of the valley, was large enough to possess 3 general stores, 6 gas stations, 3 churches, and a barber shop. By 1950, the villages seemed to embody a bygone halcyon era, a vision of simpler times. They certainly cast a powerful nostalgic spell on the big city papers. The New York Times and the Daily News both sent reporters there for a week or so, 3 years apart, and both drew heavily on interviews with Inez Atkins, postmaster of Shavertown and owner of one of its general stores, as well as with her sprightly 81-year-old neighbor Amanda Fletcher, who'd held the post office job before her. There was also Earl Van Kuren, proprietor of another general store, who was certain he would die when the village did, and sat listlessly on the porch while his daughter sold off the remaining stock. In fact, he survived. And there was Mary Fletcher Thane, beloved of all, an army nurse in World War II, who upon returning bought her riverside dream house with a window through which she could throw breadcrumbs to the fish down below for only $2,500 because her fellow citizens gallantly refrained from bidding on it. Now she'd done the unthinkable and married a construction worker on the dam from somewhere out of town. Like a Southern belle falling for one of Sherman's soldiers, wrote the Daily News, and yet she was still beloved. The Daily News, which in 1952 ran a 5-part series entitled "This Valley is Doomed," with the final word in a slashing pulp typeface, spent considerable time conducting an inventory of Mrs. Atkins's back shelves. Boot jacks, calf wieners, bull's nose rings, brass knobs for their horns, Dr. Williams's pills for pale people, and Hopping's drive-away, a panacea for colic, cholera, hysteria, scarlet fever, diphtheria, and augmented throbbing. There was a large room above the store where square dances occurred, although fewer of them recently. 3 years earlier in the Times, Mrs. Atkins had been less amenable. She charged that the city has no sentiment and referred to the authorities' rumored and publicized intentions as the pestilence that has come down through the valley, pointing out that the 1927 master plan by the Board of Water Supply, which first made known the city's interest in the East Branch, had kept property values depressed for 20 years. The condemnation process, begun in 1917, seemed to drip on endlessly. 5 years elapsed between the first buildings burned in Compacton and the last ones burned in Arena. Local newspapers marked one final curtain after another, seemingly every week. The auction at the Van Dusen farm near Shavertown, in the family since 1887. The last Christmas pageant at the Union Grove Methodist Church. The last trip on the Delaware and Northern, and the last mail at the Shavertown post office, which occurred on the same day. A month later, the last mail at the Union Grove post office, which had opened in 1857. The house-by-house sale of every building in Arena for relocation or scrap. The Catskill Mountain News published 12 verses by someone identified only as a resident of Shavertown. Nestled in a peaceful valley with the mountains towering high, shaded round by shapely maples with the river flowing by. The iron bridge, the crossroads leading from the mountains down, this a meeting place of country folks, the place called Shavertown. Now the axe of condemnation has fallen on your head. Your people have all scattered with a listless, weary tread to find a place to live in which never will be home, like travelers now in exile, cast on the world to roam. Trees uprooted, crushed and broken, pushed in mountains and pushed in piles mountains high, and the buildings cast reflections on the springtime evening sky. Oh, Shavertown still hanging by a single silver thread, which is just about to sever, and the world pronounce you dead. Thank you. I'll be happy to take questions now.
Thank you. That was quite moving. I wasn't aware of the extent of the building of the water system and how it affected, so many lives and towns. It makes sense, but after hearing these accounts, it hits home. But I thought it was fascinating. You said there was no satisfactory solution to, this competing issue of providing water for so many people in New York City. So we're going to open the floor up to the audience, and please ask questions on the chat. You can also, come off of mute if you're inclined. Use your voice and your face. While people are thinking of their questions, I was also, quite shocked to hear, how heavy-handed some of the contractors were in removing houses from people's roofs, removing furniture, with the people still living there, kind of
Well, the owners had removed their own furniture, I should point that out, because they were trying to make a last stand in their houses, and they knew something bad was going to happen, so they took everything out of the houses and camped out.
Wow. So please, if you do have questions, you're welcome to put them in the chat or come off of mute, and you can raise your hand on the on mute, excuse me, on Zoom. Okay, there's a question from Jamie Jensen, and Jamie asks, is there any movement towards rewilding the lands taken by New York City? In San Francisco, for example, there's talk of breaching the dam built in Yosemite National Park.
Well, the only thing I know about that is that the city does maintain a kind of cordon sanitaire around all of these, which is left to just go wild. I mean, it's not a very big strip, but one of the complaints I've heard, especially from Delaware County, complaints from local citizens, is that the city is buying up more and more land that's not strictly adjacent to the reservoir property, apparently making a kind of green belt. But there's no official word on this. This is all scuttlebutt, really.
I have just a comment, not really a question. My wife and I had a house in Margaretville, New York, in Delaware County for many years. And you really can't appreciate the things that you're talking about unless you spend some time there. And you mentioned something in the Catskill Mountain News. They used to have things in the Catskill Mountain News where people would just say, oh, Mary Jones came over to have tea with XYZ person. And those are the little kind of small town things that you have that in New York City you really can't appreciate. Now, on a second note, we had the house in Margaretville. This was many years ago. And there were many dairy farms up there. I went there maybe 5 or 6 years ago, and all those dairy farms are gone. You don't see any cows anymore. And it could be as a result of New York City buying a lot of the land. That we had a stream in our backyard that fed into the Delaware River, the west branch of the Delaware River, which fed into the New York City reservoirs. And cows would do what they do upstream. And New York City, I don't know if they bought that land from these farmers, but there's very little farming and dairy farming going on that I saw in Delaware County anymore. And that could be a result of the city just buying that land and making it into a greenway for the reservoir system. Those are the only comments I have.
Thank you. On the matter of dairy farms, yeah, in my book I give a set of statistics showing how the number of farms declined dramatically, but this is a process that began before the reservoirs, mind you. But I'm sure the restrictions on cattle grazing and so on had something to do with it. So, you know, it went from literally over 1,000 dairy farms in the 19th century to, you know, like 14 of them now or something like that. But one additional problem there is, and this is something that, you know, while I lived up there, I heard all the time, the major social problem represented by suicides of dairy farmers. And even today, Delaware County, the suicide rate is twice the state average. But it's a hard place to make a living because it's the soil is so rocky and the growing season is so short. And dairy farming was about the only thing. And it was partly as a result of the deforestation of nearly the whole county in the 19th century by the wood trade, lumber and the wood acid. They just denuded these slopes, and you'd have cattle grazing at absurd angles, you know, on these mountaintops. But all that forest started growing back in the early years of the 20th century. So it's another thing.
I want to add, the dairy industry went through an economic turmoil. There was a lot of consolidation, and that pushed a lot of small farmers into bankruptcy because they were not in control of the economics or the prices. And in addition to that, more and more people are drinking plant-based milks, so there's less of the demand for dairy. So there's a complex story behind the dairy farmers.
And then people grow up and they don't want to be a dairy farmer anymore because it's a rough life, and they want to go down to the big city and make their lives there. So that's part of it too, I'm sure.
Yes. So there are a lot of great questions. Let's take a couple from the chat, and then we'll come back to our friends who are raising their hands. Nancy asks, how much information about the depopulation of these lands was published in New York City, and about the resistance of the residents?
Well, much of the information I have on the Ashokan Reservoir. Well, it was covered. Yeah, it was covered more. All of these were more covered in more granular form in the local papers, like the Kingston Freeman and the Catskill Mountain News, which, by the way, stopped publication in January 2020, after 100 and however many years. But a lot of this information was available to the readers of the New York Times. Not all of it. And for example, there's a total silence on the Neversick and Rondout reservoirs, which did displace people, but they were not on a train, on a railroad line, for one thing. So they were outside the purview, right? But you know, it's newspaper stories. One day it's heartbreaking to read this, and next day you've forgotten it.
Yeah. Dave, you wanted to ask a question, please.
Thank you so much, and thanks for having us and for writing such a wonderful book. Sorry, okay, there we go. Kind of two questions. One, a general question. I was wondering about the extent of the demolition. Like, for example, the houses, were they left in place? Were they actually demolished? Trees, even the grass, things like that. And my second question was about the reservoirs themselves. See, there are different elevations in the mountains, and if they were all openly connected, then the top ones would just bottom out, and then the lowest one would just flood New York. There must be some series of sluices and blockages between, somehow regulated. Do you know much about that?
Okay, I'll take your first question first. Yeah, that's another thing about this book. When the first year I lived in Delaware County was a drought year, and like so many people, I'd heard the rumor that if the level got low enough, you should go to the reservoir because you start seeing steeples poking up. And of course, that wasn't true at all. They not only did they burn all the standing houses, but they removed the ashes. When it gets a really bad drought, we'll only show you cellars and roadbeds now. Number two, I'm not an engineer. It's not my bailiwick, but yeah, there is a series of sluices and regulatory thises and thatses, and even not just from one reservoir to another, but within the reservoirs. Such as, for example, this summer when we had a drought on the Ashokan, one half of the Ashokan was at normal levels and the other one was very, very dry. You know, they can regulate these things, and same thing. I mean, the two aqueducts that traverse the Hudson are gravity based, and they head down to some of the reservoirs in the Croton system on the east side of the Hudson, where they're chemically treated and so on. And again, the water is shifted from one reservoir to another, et cetera, and they're treated before they're sent in through city tunnels 1, 2, and 3.
Thank you. And thanks for such a great book.
Thank you.
Great. And Jill asks, Lucy, what was your greatest hope in writing the book, and do you feel like you've achieved it?
Well, my greatest hope in writing the book was to bring these stories to public knowledge, really. I didn't have an agenda in the sense that I felt that there was anything that could be done except increase awareness, in the popular phrase, right? I originally wrote this as a 4-part series in a San Francisco-based online journal called Places Journal, which is devoted to architecture, society, ecology, and so on. And I knew one of the editors there who asked me to write something, and this is a subject I'd been carrying around for 25 years. Yeah, I mean, I became alarmed at various times in the composition. I hadn't known of the city's brutality, for one thing. And then there's the fact that we have no idea what happens next. The Cannonsville Reservoir was opened in 1967. And since then, there hasn't been a single mention of a reservoir anywhere around. The closest thing was the Tox Island Reservoir in the Delaware, which was a New Jersey, Pennsylvania project that, for reasons I'm not entirely sure of, died the death in 1976, although it condemned a vast area anyway. And that would have taken some of the pressure off the Delaware reservoirs that are in New York State. The DEP has nothing to say. They just rely on the fact that water consumption, even though the population of the city has been increasing, water consumption has gone down because low flow toilets, low flow flushing, controllable faucets, that kind of thing, and also the popularity of bottled water. So we're drinking the water from wherever instead of drinking the water from New York City. Of all the suggested remedies, I mean, they really come down to two even remotely plausible ones. One is to draw on the Hudson, which is already drawn upon by various places that are above the salt line, which lies just below Poughkeepsie. So Poughkeepsie draws on the river, and so do a host of towns on the West Bank, for beginning like Port Ewan and on up, Athens, Cairo, I think, not Cairo, but maybe Catskill, and so on. And the other one, and the problem with the river, which was shunned for years and years, including in the beginning of the 20th century, because it was seen as this nest of pollution, that could be taken care of, except for the PCBs, which have a half-life of however many millions of years, and nobody's found a way to remove them. If somebody knows better, please correct me. The other possibility, which seems more plausible now than it would have in the past, is to run a pipeline from the Great Lakes. And that's something else that's been perennially brought up. My favorite, though, is the one that's never going to happen, which is to dam Long Island Sound. Can you imagine the war between Connecticut and New York? So that's where we stand right now.
Another question off the chat from Caitlin. She asks if you can expand on the excerpt that you read about changing the locks that the contractors would do, or starting a fire as soon as a resident made the mistake of leaving their house.
Well, that's pretty much all the information I have on that story. And that was Gilboa. That was from the village that was destroyed to build the Schoharie Reservoir in the 1920s. And all of those incidents are taken from accounts in the New York Times. And as far as I know, they're isolated. I didn't read anything like that about, well, the Ashokan Reservoir, you don't know, it might have happened and they didn't publicize it. It's possible. And with the later reservoirs, which were better documented, nothing like that happened. So it was really limited to that one place. And it was quixotic, of course. They could barricade their houses all they wanted, but, you know, it was going to happen whether they liked it or not. It was the kind of small scale, last ditch kind of thing that that people will resort to in times of crisis, but that, you know, are not realistic solutions.
Yeah. Okay. I'm gonna look on the chat for one more question, and then if I I have not seen, or if I had not noticed, other people from the audience that are hoping to ask a question live using your voice, please let me know, come off of mute and say so. There's a lot of people on here, so I might not have noticed. So so please do ask your question. Lorraine asks, and this was going back to the last question, is it true that New York City can no longer acquire more land through eminent domain for the reservoirs as they've done in the past?
That is the murky legal area. I'm unable to answer that question. I know that there are new regulations in place, but I don't know exactly what they are. But eminent domain, after all, is, you know, that's a legal tool. The city can use it all the time for whatever, the building of the Second Avenue subway or something, you know.
Right, good point. So we would have to assume yes. Okay, great. So this was really enlightening, and I really enjoyed hearing you read, particularly the excerpts that you chose are quite poignant. And thanks so much. And I hope we can do this again for your next book.
Thanks a lot, and thanks to you all. It's been great.
Good night, everyone.